Alright, there might be a little bit of confusion about how to do seasonality when you're calculating forecasts. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So this table below, I'm looking at example 9a on page 78 of the textbook. But before we get into that, I just want to summarize what it is that we're doing when we're performing a seasonal forecast demand. You can really break it down into three major steps. The first thing we're doing is we're looking at the actual demand from season to season. So here in this example we have 4 seasons quarterly and we have the actual demand. So this is the actual demand from season to season. The next thing we want to do is we want to assess how actual demand, which has seasonality in it, how does that compare to a non-seasonal base case? In other words, what would demand look like if there was no seasonal variation? And then we want to compare those two values. So the actual demand is the actual demand, and it includes the seasonality. But where do we get this non-seasonal base case information from? Well, we do that by calculating the centered moving average, or the CMA. The CMA, or the centered moving average, is basically the average demand for all 4 of the seasons that we're looking at. Because we're taking the average, what it does is it smooths out the seasonal variation. And if we calculate the moving average for each 4 season period, what ends up happening, the process we're doing here is we're smoothing out the seasonal variability. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to look at the difference between the actual demand, which has seasonality, and this CMA gives us an approximation of a non-seasonal base case. So it gives us a sense of what the demand would look like if there was no seasonality. And then the final step here is we measure how much greater or less than the actual demand is from our non-seasonal base case. And we do that by calculating a seasonal relative, which is the actual demand divided by our centered moving average. You'll remember the actual demand has the seasonality incorporated in it. The centered moving average is the process that we do to try to smooth out the seasonal variation so that we can have a look at what the demand would look like if there was no seasonality presence. And then this ratio tells us how much greater than or how much less than demand is versus this base case. Now, there's a little bit of confusion about how do you calculate this centered moving average. In example 9 that we're looking at here gives us a prime example of some of this confusion. So let's just walk through this. We have 4 seasons, and so we need to take the centered moving average of those 4 seasons. So here, looking at the first year, 2006, we take the average of these 4 seasons, and that gives us a centered moving average of 79.75. Now, because it's a moving average, we shift down 1 and do the same thing again. So we look at quarter 2, 3, 4, and 1. Take the average, and that gives us this value here of 78. And we just keep doing that all the way down the line. Now you'll remember what we're aiming to do is we're looking at calculating this seasonal relative. So we need to have an actual demand figure divided by our centered moving average. And here we have a bit of a problem because this centered moving average corresponds to this interval. Because we have an even number of seasons, this centered moving average corresponds to this interval between quarter 2 and quarter 3, and we don't have a demand value for that. Likewise, this centered moving average corresponds to this interval here between quarter 3 and quarter 4, and we do not have a demand value for that. So what they do is they take this centered moving average and that centered moving average, and they take the average of those, which gives us the value of 78.875. This value of 78.875 corresponds to the third quarter production value, demand value. So here we have demand, 91 units, divided by the centered moving average of 78.875. That gives us our seasonal relative of 1.154, and then we just do that all the way